Greetings, everyone. Pete Pardo here from Sea of Tranquility. Welcome to another edition of Friday Morning at the Funhouse alongside Mr. Martin Popoff. Good morning, my friend. How are you today? Happy
Yes,
Friday.
morning. Yes, thank you. Happy Friday. Yeah, it's a nice warm day. Going to get out for a jog today. Nice and sunny, not too hot. So
Yeah, did you have like sort of coolish temperatures yesterday, comparably speaking?
yeah, and a lot of heat the previous couple
Woo,
of days.
this week was murder. Holy moly,
Yeah,
like 90 degrees and 100% humidity in first week of June. No thanks to that. So any little break in the weather I'm okay with, but I like summertime, but man, that's a little too early for that. Anyway, we have now that we got the weather out of the way, we've got a pretty fun little show for you here today. Right now, it's part one of one. You never know. We could do a part two, but this is all about those bands that are not necessarily recording anymore. Maybe the band is done, whatever. We're going to compare their first album and the last album. So first in, last out, comparing a band's first and last album. So we've each picked five interesting choices where you've got these two records that in many cases, in some of these, they're going to be very different. One might be significantly better than the other, right? Or stylistically different, or just pretty interesting enough to talk about, right? So, like I said, we've each picked five bands, and we've got, obviously the two albums from each. So I'll have Martin kick us off with his first choice today.
Okay, so my first choice is this band right here, Thin Lizzy. Well, there you go. I thought this was an interesting choice. I wanted to talk about this band here. I guess we'll show both at the outset here. So I thought this was an interesting choice because Thin Lizzy started out as a band that had almost like three traditions going on. The Irish show band thing, guys were coming out of that. There was, Irish folk music is a heavy thing to those people. And and there were a lot of, Irish folklore things in what they were doing. But again, the Celtic music, Irish folk music. And then the other funny thing about them at the time is there was quite a bit of hubbub about this band Skid Row with Gary Moore and all that. So they had their own like minor CBS signing that was almost like a frantic version of Cream. So this album has a little bit of maybe all of that, plus 60 psych, and you're insular, you're young, you're insular, you're in Ireland. So it has a little bit of everything on here, and shades of is kind of the same sort of thing. So I thought that was an interesting way to start, and then very interesting way to end when you get to the old Thunder and Lightning, where they completely changed their sound for the very last record and make this super harshly recorded, non-characteristic Chris Chanzarides recording. And then obviously John Sykes is in on guitar, so there's a lot of big Guitar Hero shredding and stuff. But this is a very heavy album. Some consider it their new wave of British heavy metal cash-in album. There's your proof of that. Yep. And then you've got the lightning guitar. There's your secondary proof of that. So, and then in between, they were essentially even starting in the Eric Bell years and all the way up through, Snowy White, all through those years, they were kind of the same sort of band with that, the trademark twin leads and all that, and just, soft, pillowy, normal, conservative production values. So yeah, big, interesting change from the first two up to the last one, Thunder and Lightning. There you go.
Yeah, that's a great choice for this topic. And I always thought it was interesting, when you show the Thunder and Lightning album cover, you've got a Fender Stratocaster kind of getting hit by lightning. I was never sure what that's supposed to symbolize, because this is not a band where their guitar players played Stratocasters. You figure it would make more sense to have a Les Paul there, right? Unless that's trying to say we don't like Stratocasters, we play Les Pauls. I don't know.
Exactly. Yeah. What a silly album cover. It's really quite ridiculous. The fist coming out of the quicksand, asphalt, rocks, lava, whatever you want to call it, right?
Yep.
Yeah, that's so not Thin Lizzy, right? And they were so good about that, because they kind of like politely put down heavy metal more or less through their careers, when you would see, in interviews and stuff, which means, I think they saw themselves as a little above heavy metal. And then when they wrote either heavy metal songs or one level down, it was always kind of a little classier than standard heavy metal. So
yeah, true. But yeah, those two albums couldn't be more different, right?
Yeah.
All right. So my first choice is going to go into the prog rock world, a little band called Gentle Giant. So they released their first album in 1970, self-titled, of course, with the mascot on the front, the giant. There they are in the giant's hand. So this is a band that formed in the ashes of Simon Dupree and the Big Sound, which included the three Shulman brothers, Derek, Ray, and Phil, along with a couple other dudes, which was basically a kind of British R&B / psychedelic pop band. You know, quirky, breezy music, nothing like what would happen a year after they kind of, put that band to rest. And this album comes out and it's kind of dark, it's kind of dense. It's of course something we would later call progressive rock, but what did you call this at the time, right? It's got these little folky bits, these little medieval bits. Definitely it's got some rock, it's got some jazz and classical and a little hint of blues. None of these things ever appeared in Simon Dupree band, but there's been a lot of talk over the years about how these guys were, listening to King Crimson and maybe the early music of Yes, right? And that kind of spawned their direction. But, multiple different types of classic keyboards and violin, bass guitar, drums, saxophone in spots, vibes and xylophones and all this stuff, recorders, basically using everything but the kitchen sink. So, and this, though a fine debut, what I think foreshadowed the greatness from this band that would to come. They would really step up their game starting on the second album and certainly the third, fourth, fifth, and sixth albums, which are considered their classics. But as the 70s started to wind down, again, you have, and they weren't the only ones. We've talked about other bands plenty on this channel, especially prog bands who had a really hard time as the 70s start to wear down. You've got the rise and fall of punk, you've got new wave coming in, disco, all the, the new wave of British heavy metal is right around the corner. And what is a band like Gentle Giant supposed to do, right? Can they keep playing this quirky, complicated, kind of, not very accessible music, and as you're moving into this new decade with all these new sounds? So they put out, Giant for a Day. Well, The Missing Piece first is the first album that really started to see the shift. Then Giant for a Day, which is considered by many their weakest album. That was very poppy, very accessible, very melodic, not really like what they normally would do. And then 1980 comes around and they put out this album, Civilian, which would turn out to be the last thing they ever did. And this album kind of takes a little bit of a turn from The Missing Piece, from Giant for a Day, where it's more of a rock album. And I always kind of liken this album a little bit to like what Rush did with Moving Pictures. It's like, it's accessible, but it's still proggy, but it's still not like the early stuff. I think a lot of those kind of little quirky, folky, jazzy, classical bits are kind of gone from the band's music, but really good songs, very accessible. And I think, I've said this numerous times over the years, that had the band decided to continue on, this is not much different from what Yes we're doing with 90125, Moving Pictures with Rush, those Genesis albums, Abacab and so on and so forth. But when it came down to it, the band wasn't feeling it. And there's a perfect example. This is a perfect example of a band who is like, not really willing to change with the times because it's not them, not willing to take all these, influences of what's going on with popular music. They're like, because this isn't us. So at this point, it doesn't make any sense for us to continue as a band because we're just not feeling doing that. So sadly, 10 years is all we got from this band. But as we'll see in some of these instances, I have a couple others, it's not much more than we got with some of the other ones. Sometimes some of these classic bands were only around a finite length of time. And maybe when we look back on it, that's okay. So yeah, Genesis is my first choice. Gentle Giants, got stuck on the G's there.
Yeah, it's pretty interesting that they never reformed, right? We never got a reformation album, and a lot of these bands did, right? And the prog bands especially, you usually got that out of them, right?
Yeah, I've told Derek Shulman this plenty of times. I said, in all my years listening to prog rock and talking to so many people and, looking at forums and all that kind of stuff, the one band that gets asked the most about a reunion is these guys. And I've asked him 2 or 3 times, in the time that I know him, and I was like, would you ever consider it, even just for one gig? And he said, the problem is we've been away for too long. And if we did one, you guys would want another, and you guys would want another and another. And we don't want to fall into that trap. So he goes, we're really not interested. We appreciate and love the respect and the love from the fans. We have great memories of our legacy, but we want to kind of leave it at that.
Yeah. Yeah.
And I guess you can't blame him, right?
Yeah. Yeah, and it's so much work to even just put it all together. Fun, it's you would normally just do more, but yeah. All right, cool. Okay, so my second choice. Where's the other CD hanging around here? Oh, there we go. My second choice is this band, Queen. So there's your LP of that. There's a little CD of that, and then we get up to their last album, Made in Heaven. And very interesting story because, some people may not consider this an actual proper Last Queen album. I mean, I think it certainly is. Some might end it with innuendo, but I thought this was an interesting story because this is such a strange record in terms of how they sort of decided. I mean, it is kind of like a goodbye to Freddie record, although Freddie's all over it. It's the stuff he was recording at the end, but they became a band that really wanted to do like very conservative, almost like really pedestrian piano ballad type stuff. It's a very conservative album without much Brian on it. The lyrics are just almost like so plainly about Freddie on his way out, and in such kind of like a rosy, incense and peppermint sort of way. It's there's nothing really deep on it. It's almost like Queen is putting themselves out there as the most regular people in the world, where they weren't very regular at all. They were actually larger than life in so many ways. I mean, kind of like all of them were to a large extent. Maybe the least John Deacon and the second least Brian May, I suppose. But yeah, so they start off very completely progressive and genius and a lot of guitar and raw and rocking out, and then they end with this. But even if you consider innuendo, I think there's partially the same story in that Brian seems to have even when he is playing guitar, his guitar style has changed so much, starting really back at I would say The Works and those sorts of records, right? Miracle, all of that, all along the way. And Innuendo, I think, is a little bit of an overrated album. People really romanticize that record a lot because most of the time they're really just thinking of the title track. But even songs like Headlong and Hitman and stuff like that, it just seems like they forgot or they lost the plot in terms of knowing how to write hard rock stuff, and then the other stuff fills in along the sides, and you like some of it and you don't like some of it. But I found this to be a really odd, I have to say it's my least favorite Queen album as well, and I just find it completely baffling in how it's almost like a bunch of Elton John songs. That's kind of the way I look at it. So weird way to go out, as is Innuendo, really. I mean, Innuendo is considered by the flock to be, somewhat of improvement over your Another Kind of Magic and your Miracle and those kinds of records. But it ticks off all the same boxes as those albums. I don't find it very, creative. So yeah, miles and miles and miles away from Queen in the 70s, which I'll swear up and down to anybody who wants to talk about it. Queen and Priest in the 70s and Queen in the 70s are the only two examples, and the Beatles somewhat are the only three examples of pure objective genius in all of rock and roll. So there you go.
Yeah, that Made in Heaven album, when that came out, I bought it, of course. We were all still reeling from the death of Freddie, and we're like, okay, we got some new Queen music, right? They were working on before he died. And I remember putting that on and I was completely baffled. And I was like, what is this? I mean, I still, to this day, I can't even listen to it. it's horrible. It's boring. It's depressing. It's a complete downer of an album. And for me, I mean, I think I have a lot of respect for Innuendo. I think Innuendo is a pretty good album. And I don't know, you bring up some good points. I don't know if it's because it is such a good album in my eyes, or because it is, marginally better than those couple that came before, which, are hit and miss. I think there's fine material on, the works, and it's a kind of magic. And there's some good material on those albums. I don't think any of them are classics by any means. And I just wonder if we look higher at Innuendo because of that. But I know here in North America, and you can attest to this, I mean, those couple of Queen albums that came out before Innuendo were not pushed here at all. I mean, I think most people never bought them, never knew they came out. But Innuendo, when it came out, was pushed pretty heavily here. And I don't know why there was that. But yeah, Made in Heaven is just bad. And they're like two different bands when you listen to those two albums. I mean, I know there's many years in between, but here you got this brash, heavy rockin' kind of glammy band from the early 70s. And then you have that, which is just, to me, just sounds like a collection of stuff that was laying around the studio, and let's just get something out to get something out as a way to pay tribute to Freddie. But I thought they paid a great tribute to Freddie with that whole concert they put on. And for me, that was all that was needed.
Yeah.
So.
Yeah, it almost sounds like with It's a Beautiful Day, all that. It sounds like the kind of music that like some rich elderly woman would put on as they sat down for their breakfast, at Montreux overlooking the lake, right?
Right.
That's really what, just the most innocuous, quiet background music for someone who's not really into music, who sounds really rich, and is just, like when, where those recordings took place, just sitting out there on a sunny morning at 6:30 in the morning, looking over the lake,
the sunrise,
and sitting down, getting served by your servants. Here's your orange, and here's your coffee, and here's your croissant. Right.
Have a good day. Enjoy. We won't give you anything too. Then you
Is the music too loud, love? Let me turn that
from the
down.
grave on the cover. Yeah, it's kind of ridiculous. I mean, like I said, I bought it when it came out. I couldn't even tell you the last time I listened to it. I used to struggle just trying to, I should get to know this album because I love Queen and whatever. But I'm like, oh, this is no good. All right, next up for me, I'm going to stick on prog rock here. Emerson, Lake and Palmer. All right, so of course the supergroup to end all supergroups back in the day. First album comes out in 1970. The band makes their live debut at the Isle of Wight Festival. This album does all sorts of big business. It's got Lucky Man on it, Knife Edge, The Barbarian, Take a Pebble, all these great songs. Keith Emerson, Greg Lake, Carl Palmer, we know the pedigree, great stuff. And throughout the decade, they basically are one of the biggest prog bands on the planet. Selling out tours, selling lots of albums. They had their share of radio songs, right? But for the most part, this band was all about the bombast and whatnot. Well, the 70s kind of came to an end. The band releases the terrible Love Beach with that awful album cover, and the music, half of it's okay, the rest is pretty forgettable. That basically kills the band. Then obviously Asia forms. Then we do this little semi-reunion thing called Emerson, Lake and Powell, which obviously people still have fond memories of ELP. That album does really, really well. That doesn't last too long. The band comes back in the early 90s and reunites, and they release two albums. The last one comes out in 1994 called In the Hot Seat. The album before it, pretty decent. Again, it's not we're in the 90s now, so it's not as big and bombastic as the early stuff. Obviously, it's a little safer, whereas this album, could you even call it safe? I don't know. It's just not very interesting. It's very poppy. You're waiting for all those big, huge Keith Emerson flourishes on the many synthesizers. And it's just a very kind of piano, organ, light synths, kind of jazzy, poppy album with none of the real flair that we really want from the band. And they kind of just go out with a whimper. They play some live stuff. They come back a couple times, play a few live dates and things like that. And that would be it. And now, sadly, two of the three guys are no longer with us. But yeah, this is in like a lion, out like a lamb, or something even more quiet than a lamb, I guess. But
I gotta laugh every time I think of them. I remember, the producer Keith Olson, who's sadly no longer with us. He said to me once, "For Carl Palmer, time was a magazine." Meaning he couldn't keep time on the drums, right? So
The love, though,
pretty
right?
funny.
Yeah, I mean, it's yeah,
For
great
Carl,
band.
time was a magazine. Yeah. Okay, so my next choice, kind of to represent, what happened to a lot of these punk and new wave bands. I'm going to go with the Jam. This is their last album, The Gift. I don't have a picture. I've got my box set. I got a little picture that the debut here, but love this band to death. There's what their debut looked like in the city. There's their other ones there.
Wow, would you actually call them a punk band? I knew so many guys, like when I was going to college,
Yeah.
with the Jam, and I would hear their music from time to time. And I mean, what do you call that stuff?
Yeah, I'd call it three different things. A little bit, you could call it a little bit of a punk band, but they're certainly the number one by a long shot, the mod revival band. And they're essentially like a more grinding and guitar-y and powerful and raw version of the Kinks. That's really what they are. They're like a revival of the Kinks with all the same storytelling. They cover the Kinks and stuff as well. But when there was that small pocket, that little dribble of a thing, I did a whole episode of History in 5 Songs on the mod revival and how it was quite a fizzle, really. But the Jam were far and away the big one, and every one of their records went gold in the States, pretty much. I think 1 or 2 not, but no, I picked them because they only made, I think, 6 records, 5 records, something like that. Anyways, they end with The Gift, and there's this is a framed up what is this, the tour program for it. But I thought it was a little bit of an interesting story because it's this idea of you go from this mod revival band, which again, they really didn't have a lot of punk to them, kind of just like the Stranglers, but they go from that. And a lot of these bands along the way, they run into, so many things going on in that scene where there's ska and reggae, mainly ska, which is kind of like sped up reggae. But there was always this big Northern Soul collector, collecting Northern Soul. Like all those 45s were always super, super expensive, and being into Northern Soul. And the Jam, Paul Weller kind of went that way, and it more or less broke up the band. I imagine it was one of the main reasons for breaking up the band, how the music was getting, I'm sure they were looking in different directions. But this has a lot of kind of Northern Soul to it and funk to it, and it's got a horn section on a bunch of songs. There's songs like Precious, Town Called Malice was a big hit on this. But it's probably my least favorite Jam album. I love the middle ones to death. They're one of my favorite bands. And like I say, I mean, if you like the Kinks, you should be able to like the Jam, because there's not really much I would say punk to it. But yeah, I just wanted to pick them as one of these examples of how many of those bands changed rapidly through that whole punk era, which is 77. By 78, punk is kind of dead over there, or it's changing a lot, and we get to this post-punk thing where people are trying a lot of different things. Talk about a radical example: Sex Pistols into PIL with John Lydon, right? And there's many, many more examples, but I wanted to pick one example of that. And then after this, Paul Weller, goes into that weird Style Council band, which is like, blue-eyed soul, I suppose. Very, very kind of steely, trebly production values. So it's a little bit Hall and Oates, I imagine you could call it. And then his solo career, he's very varied in what he does across the solo career. But yeah, they just kind of got enamored with that funk soul horns thing as they were moving towards the end. And I wasn't too on board with that. There you go.
He's had a long solo career, huh?
Oh yeah, lots and lots of records.
Yeah. All right, another British band here. Their debut came out in 1974. By 78, 79, the band was, I think 79, the band was pretty much done already. Bebop Deluxe. So Bill Nelson and company, they released this debut, Axe Victim, in 1974, which is a pretty hard rocking kind of glammy affair, probably not too far removed from what Bowie and the Spiders of Mars were doing at the time. A lot of great guitar work, kind of quirky, very British sounding, but pretty upbeat and energetic. And like I said, it's perhaps their heaviest album, but again, we're not talking like heavy metal or anything like that, but just kind of like definitely like those couple of Bowie and Iggy and the Ziggy albums. That's kind of the style here, and I think he was very influenced by Bowie around that time. You can even kind of tell by the way they were dressed and the way they looked there with a little bit of makeup and stuff like that. But this band would release 5 studio albums in a short period of time, and each album sounds completely different than the one that came before it. So this band continued to move on, through Futurama, Sunburst Finish, and modern music. And by the time they got to Jurassic Plastic in 1978, all of the elements that were present on this album and even the second album or even the proggy third album, pretty much gone by here. And here it's like this band, who I always thought were way ahead of everybody else, were kind of already doing the new wave thing way before new wave became a thing. So they were taking, influences from punk and other forms of music and forming this new style for their own band, for Bebop Deluxe, probably a year or so before most people would really embrace what we would then call new wave. And a lot of the heavier guitar stuff is basically gone by this time. A lot of keyboards, shorter songs, still really catchy and quirky and eclectic, which was always a trademark of these guys. But by the time they released this, Bill had already been like, all right, I think I've done about as far as I can go with this band. And they've got quite the legacy of 4 or 5 years, 5 really great albums, and that's it. So wow, these two couldn't be more different from each other.
Yeah, that's interesting. Thanks for that. I mean, I that's a band I've owned all those records all my life, but I've never, it's never sunk in. I don't know them really well, but every time I put them on, I really liked them. And I was kind of like, it also hadn't sunk in how short the career was and how few albums there were.
Crazy, right?
Yeah. Wow. Because I really like that very first Bill Nelson solo album, and I can't remember the name of it, but with the kind of the robot on the cover. I thought that was pretty cool. And then later after that, they got quite electronic, right?
Oh yeah.
So, all right. My next choice is this band right here, and everything's kind of encapsulated in this whole frame thing that I've got. So it's so we start with Ritchie Blackmore's Rainbow, the main album, and then we end with this one over here, Ritchie Blackmore's Rainbow. So I thought that was kind of a funny one to pick because they start with an album by Ritchie Blackmore's Rainbow and they end with an album called Ritchie Blackmore's Rainbow, and all the albums in between are just by Rainbow, right? But in terms of the sound of the band, it's almost like they start with one sound, then they have another sound for a couple of albums, the second and third with Ronnie, and then they have another sound on Down to Earth, my favorite Rainbow album, and then they have another sound on the Trilogy, the Joe Lynn Turner albums, and then they have another sound again way later. So we get up into 1995. That album arises because of the whole can we get Ritchie back in the band again, and all of a sudden he gets offered a $1 million solo deal. And he goes, well, yeah, okay, I guess I'll take that. That sounds pretty cool. So he does that, and then later on, it turns into this last Rainbow album. But it's funny. I would say that last album, Stranger in Us All, with that really cool title. I really like that title. I like the cover of it as well, where he kind of looks like a scarecrow on there, right?
Yeah.
Yeah. It's pretty cool. It's a cool cover and it's a cool title. I just wish it was maybe a Ritchie solo album, or maybe just call it Rainbow instead of Ritchie Blackmore's Rainbow. I've never been crazy about it because of the production and the performances. I think both of them are just too polite. But those songs, I've always said that, had they recorded them live off the floor with, a couple hours into, hanging out at Ritchie's famous basement bar, I think it's in his basement, and recorded it there and did that, it probably would have been a real banger of an album, because the songs are sitting there ready to come alive, but they never come alive on that album. And then similarly, I think the first album also kind of has that problem that it's just a little bit too there's no real band chemistry between Richie and Elf, I don't think, on that first album. And it's a little all over the place. I don't like the production very much. So again, yeah, I never really thought of it. There seems to be kind of a lack of chemistry on the first album and a lack of chemistry on the last album. And they're both called Richie Blackmore's Rainbow album. So there you go.
Yeah. I mean, I like Stranger in a Soul. But I always felt, I agree with you, I don't like the whole Richie Blackmore's Rainbow thing. And it's almost like they give you this tease of an album thinking Rainbow is back, and then it was one and done, that's it. And I think that I always go back to that more than anything else. It's like, why do that if it was only ever intended to be kind of like a one and done thing? So maybe that would have been a better Blackmore solo album, right? And don't even call it Rainbow. And maybe we'd look back a little more fondly on that album.
Yeah. Yeah, it just strikes me. I mean, I hear these albums all the time, like Robert Plant, Shaken and Stirred, and sometimes I even think of this of some of those keyboardy Rush albums that I wish they could be kind of completely overhauled, but keep the same songs and just do it a whole different way. And that's how I feel about that record.
Yeah, the songs are good on that album. I totally agree. I think Doogie sounds great on it, but you had to wonder like how much Richie's like heart was really into it. Just like, I mean, I got to be honest with you. It's like, I thought it was cool that he kind of put the band, whatever you want to call it, Rainbow, back together in recent years. If you've seen any of those performances, I mean, he just doesn't seem to be into it. It's like, why do it then? It's like, if you're not going to go all gung ho, and why bother? Because I don't know. I watched those live performances. I'm kind of like, yeah, this really isn't very good. It's like I was psyched that Rainbow was back, but then I'm like, that's not the Rainbow I want to remember,
Yeah, for sure.
All right. My next, Steely Dan, 1972, right? Or 72, 74, whatever year this came out, 72. Can't Buy a Thrill. So here you have this kind of cool, quirky, jazzy rock band with some, top-notch musicians putting out this very, very different style of music. Call it pop, call it rock, call it jazz rock, a bit of funk. You got a little bit of everything on here. The band kind of is popular right from the get-go, right? A lot of hit singles throughout their career. Nobody sounds like Steely Dan. Very original. They sell plenty of records throughout the 70s into the early 80s. They eventually become more of a studio project. They stop touring. Walter Becker and Donald Fagen basically are like, all right, we don't want to go out on the road anymore. So what we're going to do is we're going to kind of make each album, we're going to bring in the best musicians possible. So it becomes less of a steady band and more of like a project. And the albums they go from, having lots of rock-based band sounding early albums to these very meticulous creations, which again, brought them a lot of acclaim, a lot of singles, and great production values, all that sort of thing. But by the early 80s, they released Gaucho, and that's kind of it, right? Both of those guys go solo. We don't see Steely Dan till, again, they go and play shows here and there. We don't see another album till 2000. Then in 2003, we see Everything Must Go, which is the last studio album we've seen from them. The band has been touring, but Walter passed away a few years ago, so it's basically the Donald Fagen show now. And I don't know if we'll ever see another album from them again at this point. But, this is decent, but this lacks the kind of daring nature of the early stuff. It's pleasant. It's melodic, but it's very safe. And, there's a reason why I think most Steely Dan fans, when you ask them about the discography, they talk about the last two albums they did as nice listens, but they don't really compare to the early stuff because there's just really something missing. The songs kind of all tend to sound the same. It's very jazzy, poppy, laid back, and missing a lot of those great guitar solos and saxophone solos and everything that made the early discography of Steely Dan so appealing. Not really there. Good stuff, but not comparable, certainly not classic to those early albums. So again, you listen to these two back to back, completely different. I mean, this has just some absolute classics on it, and this one, a nice listen. Classics, not really.
Yeah, interesting. I mean, I hope I'm saying this right, but is it Chimera Cad, that Donald Fagen album?
Oh, the solo album. Yeah, that's
The
good.
blue one, yeah.
Yeah.
And that's more like a Steely Dan album, really,
Yeah,
right?
his
I
solo
would
albums
say.
are very Steely Danish, especially that first one.
Yeah.
They're as good.
Oh
If
yeah,
not better.
Nightfly is the other one I'm thinking of. Nightfly, yeah.
Yeah,
Yeah.
yeah,
Yeah, for sure. I mean, those are almost the follow-up to Gaucho, right?
basically, yeah,
In
yeah,
a way. Yeah.
yeah.
Yeah. Cool. All right. So my last choice is this band here, the Stooges. So here's their debut, and here's a CD of it. I don't have their very last album, but that's making the same point. This is their second to last album, because they basically made two reunion albums, The Weirdness and Ready to Die. There's a shot of what they looked like. That's Scott and Ron, both no longer with us. Iggy is still with us. Yep. Against common sense, he's still with us. But the point I wanted to make here, it's kind of a weird point. I might even do a whole episode of History in 5 Songs on it. But the whole idea of when you have a band like this that is based on, their legend is based on being you had to be there, and it's really rough, and the atmosphere, and it's crazy and raw, and oh my God,
the element.
Yeah. And how dare they make an album like that, kind of thing. So as you move on through life, I mean, they did that on here, they did that on Funhouse, they did that on Raw Power. All three of those kind of have the same kind of thing. We got 70, 71, and 73, right? So when you have that, what happens when you move up to the modern day, and all of heavy metal history has gone by, and all of punk history has gone by, and all of garage rock history is distance past, 65, 66, 67, even before the Stooges. What happens when you get up to the modern day, and it's expected that a record more or less sounds right, and can you be dangerous? Your old guys or whatever. So are you going to make a primitive record? I mean, how can you can't win. You can't win when you're the Stooges. So, and you can't win when you're Iggy Pop. When he makes a record that sounds like, raw and heavy early Iggy Pop, people clamor and ask him to make a record like early Iggy Pop, but then half the time they're asking him to make a record like the Stooges, right? So you get basically 2 or 3 Iggy Pop albums that sound like Stooges albums as well. So he goes and makes these last 2 records, and it's dangerous, and and trying to be shocking with the lyrics and stuff, and it's rock and roll. And on the last one, Steve McKay is in there doing the sax thing, which reminds me of how in Southern rock all through time, you've got to have the tinkly grand piano classic on your albums, right? So that's the same thing. Steve McKay, we had this sax guy back in the old days, we got to put sax on it, right? Mike Watt's in there, so he was a part-time Stooge. So he's legitimately in there. James Williamson is legitimately in there. Scott Ashton is still alive on the last one, but Ron is gone. As I say, Ron and Scott are both on this one. But again, both of them they kind of came and went. And you could tell all the reviewers and all the fans are kind of having this debate that I'm kind of trying to explain right now, subconsciously or unconsciously anyways. It's like, how do you win, right? How does any punk band win when they come back? Do you keep making that music that was so, vital and important and magic in 1977? And we see this with some of our metal bands too, in a subtle way. When Accept makes these modern day albums, when Saxon makes these modern day albums, when Priest makes these modern day albums, they don't sound like the old stuff, and we all complain. And yet at the same time, we kind of are happy for the professionalism, but they just sound like power metal albums that younger power metal bands are making anyways, right? So what do? You can't win. So the whole idea here is that idea of how do you combine what you did in the past with what you're doing now? It's really hard to do.
It's really hard to do, and you can't win because you're never going to make everybody perfectly happy, right? Yeah. That's a discussion I get into with people all the time about so many different bands. All right. Led Zeppelin, 1969. Led Zeppelin 1. We move into Led Zeppelin 2. Of course, everybody has heard these albums countless times, very blues based, right? Throughout the 70s, the band would start to incorporate the third album. You got bits of folk. You got the fourth album has the folk, has some of the blues, has the heavy rock. Then you got Houses of the Holy, which brings in other elements. You got little bits of, quirky pop and reggae, right? Then you got Physical Graffiti, which has a little bit of everything and then some. Presence, right? Also dips into a lot of what they do. And then this album comes out, which is drastically different than everything else that came before it. Here is a more mature, kind of sophisticated Led Zeppelin, right? As it turns out, John Paul Jones was the driving force behind this album due to Jimmy having all sorts of issues going on in his personal life. So John kind of took the ball and ran with it. A lot of keyboards on this album, a lot of different flavors. A lot of interesting textures. It's definitely not your big heavy Led Zeppelin album. It's not an overly bluesy album. It's not a folky album, right? But it's a good one, and most people have fond memories of this album. And then, of course, Bonzo dies, and that's the end of Led Zeppelin. And you have to wonder, kind of looking back, for folks who were huge Led Zeppelin fans from the beginning, and maybe still are, you have to wonder and ponder. It's like, well, if Bonzo hadn't died, would we still have wanted Led Zeppelin to go down this road that was started with this album? Do we really want a very sophisticated, mellow Led Zeppelin? Or was this the best way for this band to go out basically 10 years into their career, right? I think another band that was around for basically a decade. We've talked about a few of them here today. And was this a fitting end to a mighty, legendary band?
Yeah, boggles the mind where they would have went, right? I mean, you think of I guess that the clue might have been the first Robert Plant album and maybe the two Firm albums, right. I suppose.
Would we have wanted pedestrian Led Zeppelin?
Yeah, and and now we get into the big debate. I mean, there's a few bands that went super heavy when the new wave of British heavy metal came out, and then there's more bands that really embraced the keyboard technology even more, right? So would Zeppelin have, you look all through that period. I mean, it almost seems like Jimmy Page wouldn't allow them to include too many of the 80s production travesties on the albums, but that doesn't mean we'd get good albums either. I mean, I think, with maybe, I think of, well, I mean, the two Firm albums are just very retro sounding in every way. And the writing is very odd on them. Right.
Yeah.
But yeah, it almost, because to me that in Through the Outdoor almost really sounds like the blueprint there. To me, that almost leads to the two Firm albums and Outrider a little bit, right?
Yep. Yep.
And nothing else. I mean, not really the Robert Plant albums, not Page Plant, not Walking into Clarksdale, any of that, right?
Yeah, true.
So,
and knowing what we know about Jimmy's state of mind and all of his demons that he was struggling with throughout those years, you have to wonder too, had Bonzo not died and Zeppelin continued, what that would have meant for Jimmy. Because he was not well throughout the whole Firm period, and after that, I mean, he spent a good chunk of the 80s in kind of like this drug-induced fog, and you have to wonder if the stress and the rigors of the road for Zeppelin, had they continued, you just have to wonder, right, and look back on that. Or would that have or was the demise of Led Zeppelin what made things worse for him throughout the next couple of years? I don't know, because I'm not in his head, so I don't know what would have happened. But it's interesting to kind of think about, had Bonzo not died, and what would have happened after that.
And it's interesting, the whole first in, first last with those two records. It's like the last album is certainly a pretty creative album. And the first record, it's almost like the creativity is not inside of each song. It's the combining of all those songs on one record. You get a little bit of creativity with a little bit of somewhat invention of certain heavy metal tropes, with Good Times, Bad Times, a communication breakdown, a little bit with How Many More Times. But it's more like you've got folk music with this nascent heavy metal and some of the better British blues boom music all stuck on one record, and that is the creativity. And there's really not much creativity on the second album late either. And the most creative ones are probably House of the Holy, Physical Graffiti, and then maybe In Through the Outdoor. Yeah. But yeah, pretty interesting. You get the roots of some sort of creativity that show up on the last one, right?
Yeah, I mean, I think they were the right band, right time. There was a brashness, there was a musical virtuosity. They had the look. I mean, they had it all, right? I mean, when they debuted on the scene, I think the rock world was looking for that next big thing, and they were it, right? And they had the albums backed it up. The albums are great, and I mean, Led Zeppelin was on top of the world before you knew it. So,
yeah, cool.
The rest is history.
Right on.
The rest is history, as we say. So there you have it, everybody. So. First in, last out. 5 good picks from each of us. I don't know, Martin. What do you think? I got more if we want to do another episode.
Yeah, we'll talk about it. Let me see what I've got. I even had an honorable mention, Standing by the Wings, but yeah, maybe I can come up with 4 more. So
yeah, I put together a whole list, and I had to pick my 5, and I got the other ones waiting in the wings. So we'll talk about it. We'll see. Okay. We've got a couple other things scheduled though for the next few weeks. So, but if we do a part 2 of this, look for it in a couple of weeks. So, Martin, what's new on the book front? What do you got in? What's shipping? What's
not much. Just martinpopoff.com for all the books. I will have the Uriah Heep hopefully sometime middle of next week. Other than that, nothing really new. I'm working on that Damned book. Speaking of Led Zeppelin, I mean, I saw one little nugget where there was a thought at one point that Jimmy Page would have produced a Damned album, and he was into the energy of punk, but we never really saw that, when it came to In Through the Outdoor. But it's true. Funny. If it would have been neat if Led Zeppelin would have been one of those bands that went totally new wave of British heavy metal, right? Turned in their heaviest album in 1982, right?
Can you imagine? Wow.
Yeah.
Cool. Well, definitely put aside a Uriah Heep book for me. And while you're at it, you have any Merciful Fate books left?
No, that's now out of print. The Van Halen's now out of print. I haven't decided whether to put them back in print. The third Iron Maiden is out of print. This morning, I did receive more copies of Where Eagles Dare, Iron Maiden in the 80s. So I do have that one, and I do have Holy Smoke, but I don't know if I'm going to put the third one ever back in print. So they're up and down all over the place.
Yeah, I can imagine. Well, if you decide to put the Merciful Fate one back in print, let me know. So I should have picked that up. I don't know why I never did.
Yeah, you guys been talking about them lately.
Yeah, we did that show last week, and that I've been listening to them nonstop for like 3 weeks. And I'm like, oh, I never read that book. I should have picked it up. So yeah, well, let me know. So
all right.
There you have it, everybody. Visit us on the web at www.seatranquility.org. We're on Facebook. We're on Twitter. Of course, we're here on YouTube all the damn time. Happy Friday to everybody. Of course, you got 2 episodes from us today, so hope you've enjoyed both of them. For Martin Popoff, I am Pete Pardo. We'll see you with more stuff over the weekend and into next week. Remember, Monday starts the regular programming. Hudson Valley Squares in the Prague seat. What's Hot with Sea of Tranquility, Monsters Dan, and Friday at the Fun House with the 2 of us. So thanks for watching, everybody. For Martin Popoff, I am Pete Pardo. Have a good one.